In 1989, a Wisconsin State Highway Patrol dispatcher received a call that would reshape how I understood the boundaries between what we acknowledge and what we ignore. The woman on the line was Barbara Hendricks, a night shift nurse driving home on Highway 18 outside Jefferson County. Her voice stayed controlled through the entire report, even as she described watching something massive crouch over a deer carcass, tearing at it with movements that belonged to neither man nor wolf. The creature lifted its head when her headlights swept across it, and for 3 seconds, they regarded each other through her windshield. Then it stood upright on 2 legs and walked calmly into the marsh grass. So before we continue, please make sure to leave a like and let us know where you're watching from. Thanks. I was the responding officer that night. My name is David Marsh, and I'd been with the Jefferson County Sheriff's Department for 6 years by then. October 31st, 1989. Yes, Halloween, which made everyone immediately assume the call was either a prank or a misidentification. The dispatcher, Janet, radioed me at 2:47 a.m. with barely suppressed skepticism in her tone. We had a wildlife incident report on Highway 18, mile marker 47. Possible injured animal in roadway, she said. Then she paused and added, caller claims it wasn't exactly an animal. The drive out took me 23 minutes. The night was unusually warm for late October, somewhere in the high 50s, with a thick fog settling into the low areas along the Crawfish River. My patrol car's headlights could only penetrate about 30 feet into that soup. I found Barbara Hendricks' blue Dodge Caravan parked on the shoulder with her hazards blinking. She sat inside with the doors locked and the engine running. When I tapped on her window, she studied my badge and uniform carefully before rolling it down halfway. Her scrubs were still clean and pressed despite her 12-hour shift at Mercy Hospital. Her hands weren't shaking, and her eyes were clear. This wasn't hysteria or exhaustion. Barbara Hendricks was probably the most composed witness I'd ever encountered at a scene. "You can think I'm crazy," she said before I could speak. "I've been sitting here for 15 minutes trying to convince myself I didn't see what I saw, but I know what I saw." I asked her to describe the incident from the beginning. She checked her rearview mirror, then looked at me directly. "I take this route home 5 nights a week. I know every curve, every dip, every place where deer like to cross. At marker 47, there's that straightaway before the bridge over the marsh. That's where it was." She'd been driving 45 miles per hour, below the speed limit because of the fog. Her high beams were on. The deer carcass appeared first, a large doe lying half on the shoulder, half in the roadway. She started to slow down to go around it when she saw movement. Something large was hunched over the carcass. "My first thought was a bear," she said, "though we don't get many bears this far south. But the proportions were wrong. The limbs were too long, and it was using its hands, actual hands, to pull at the deer's rib cage." I wrote everything down, using my flashlight to see the notepad. "Can you describe the size?" "Bigger than any man I've seen. Maybe 7 feet tall when it stood up, covered in dark fur, but not like a bear's fur. Longer, more like a German shepherd's coat, but darker. Gray-brown, maybe black in places. The fog and the lights made it hard to tell." "You said it stood up?" She nodded. "When my lights hit it full on, it had been on all fours, but not like a normal animal, more like a person crawling, if that makes sense. The joints bent the same way ours do. When it stood, it did it smoothly, like it was comfortable on 2 legs. That's when I saw its face. I kept my expression neutral. Tell me about the face." Barbara looked out through her windshield toward the spot she'd indicated. Extended like a dog's snout, but not as long as a wolf's. The eyes reflected yellow-green in my headlights. Very wide set. The ears sat high on the skull, but they were pointed, mobile. It was looking right at me, Officer Marsh. Not through me or past me like a startled animal. At me. There was recognition there. What did it do then? It picked up the deer, the whole deer, with one arm, like you'd carry a bag of groceries. Then it walked on 2 legs into the marsh grass. Not ran, walked, like it didn't care that I was watching. The grass is only about 4 feet high there, but I lost sight of it immediately, like it just vanished. I looked at my notes. Everything she described was specific, detailed, consistent. No elaboration, no dramatic flourishes. I'd interviewed hundreds of witnesses over the years, and Barbara Hendricks showed none of the signs of deception or confusion. "Will you show me the exact spot?" I asked. She hesitated, then turned off her engine. "Stay close to your car," she said. "I'm a nurse. I've seen what large animals can do to human bodies." We walked to mile marker 47. The fog had thickened, reducing visibility even further. My flashlight beam looked solid in the moist air. Barbara stopped about 10 feet from a dark stain on the asphalt. "There," she said. The blood was still wet. Fragments of fur and tissue spread across a 6-foot area. Deep gouges scored the pavement where claws had scraped against it. But what caught my attention were the prints in the blood. They were large, maybe 14 inches long, with a clear pad and 5 toes. But the proportions were wrong for any animal I knew. The toes were too long, almost finger-like, with claw marks at the tips. I crouched down for a closer look. Some of the prints showed what looked like a partially opposable digit, like a thumb. The stride pattern was also unusual, sometimes bipedal, sometimes quadrupedal, with no consistent gait. "There's more," Barbara said quietly. She pointed to the shoulder where the marsh grass began. I followed her gesture and saw the grass had been pushed down in a clear path. But the disturbing part was how the path ended after about 12 feet. The grass simply stopped being disturbed, as if whatever made the trail had vanished or taken to the air. But the grass was 4 feet high. Even something jumping would have left signs of landing. I photographed everything with the department's Polaroid camera. 23 photos total. The blood, the prints, the grass trail, the abrupt ending. I measured the prints, noted the temperature, 57 degrees, the time 3:16 a.m., and the exact location. I even made a plaster cast of the clearest print, though I had to wait 40 minutes for it to set properly in the humid air. While we waited, Barbara told me more about herself. She'd been an ER nurse for 12 years. She'd seen trauma, death, and psychiatric emergencies. She knew the difference between reality and hallucination. She had no history of mental illness, took no medications except occasional aspirin, didn't drink, didn't use drugs. "I need you to believe that I'm credible," she said, "because I know how this sounds. But Officer Marsh, that thing was real. It was solid. It left evidence, and it was intelligent." I believed her. That was the problem. We finished processing the scene at 4:45 a.m. I drove Barbara back to her van and followed her home to make sure she arrived safely. Before she went inside, she turned to me. "You're going to file a report," she said. It wasn't a question. "I have to." "What will you say?" I considered the question. "Unknown animal incident. Highway hazard. Blood and tissue samples collected for analysis." She nodded slowly. "That's probably best. But Officer Marsh, we both know that wasn't unknown. That was impossible." I filed my report that morning. I listed facts, only location, time, physical evidence, witness statement. I didn't speculate on the nature of the animal. I submitted the blood and tissue samples to the state lab with a request for species identification. The photographs went into evidence storage. The plaster cast went onto my desk. The lab results came back 2 weeks later. The blood was from a white-tailed deer, consistent with a vehicle strike. But mixed in with the deer blood were traces of saliva containing unusual enzymes. The lab tech had written a note. "Saliva shows markers consistent with Canis genus, but with anomalies. Recommend additional testing." Additional testing never happened. The sample was somehow lost and transferred to the university lab. The photographs I'd taken developed oddly while the blood and scene were clear. Anything showing the prints or trail came out overexposed, as if there had been a light leak in the camera. The plaster cast was the only physical evidence that remained intact. I started investigating on my own time. I pulled records of unusual animal sightings in Jefferson County going back 20 years. What I found disturbed me more than Barbara's encounter. October 1973. A farmer named Clarence Bauer reported something walking upright through his cornfield. His dogs refused to track it. August 1976. Two teenagers camping at Kettle Moraine State Forest claimed a large bipedal creature stalked their campsite. They left everything and ran. When rangers checked the next day, the tent was shredded and all their food was gone. December 1981. A truck driver named Miguel Santos crashed on Highway 18, claiming he swerved to avoid a wolf man in the road. He was tested for drugs and alcohol, completely clean. April 1985. Three children reported seeing a dog monster near Aztalan State Park. Their drawings, made separately, were disturbingly consistent. September 1988. A year before Barbara's encounter, a state trooper named James Wright filed a report about finding mutilated deer remains arranged in a pattern near the same marsh. He noted ritualistic placement and took photographs. Wright transferred to another county 2 months later and wouldn't return my calls. The sightings clustered around the same area, a rough triangle between Jefferson, Fort Atkinson, and Lake Mills. The center of this triangle was the Crawfish River Marsh System, thousands of acres of wetlands, some of it still unmapped. I decided to investigate the marsh in daylight first. On November 15th, my day off, I drove to where Barbara had seen the creature enter the grass. The autumn had turned the marsh brown and gold. Cattails stood in thick walls along the water channels. The ground was spongy, covered in deer trails and muskrat paths. I followed what might have been the creature's trail from the highway. After 12 feet, just as Barbara had described, the disturbance simply ended, but I noticed something else. The ground there was slightly depressed in a circular pattern, about 8 feet in diameter. The grass grew differently inside this circle, shorter, darker, growing in a subtle spiral pattern. I found 6 more circles as I explored deeper into the marsh. They seemed randomly placed, but when I marked them on my topographical map that evening, they formed a rough line pointing toward an old, abandoned quarry about 2 miles into the wetlands. The quarry had been closed since 1952 after a worker disappeared and the owners went bankrupt. Local teenagers sometimes went there to drink, but most people avoided it. The water that filled the quarry pit was said to be impossibly deep, and 2 drownings in the 1,960 seconds had given it a bad reputation. I returned the next day with better equipment, a compass, a better camera, plaster for more casts, and my off-duty weapon. The hike to the quarry took 3 hours through increasingly difficult terrain. The paths seemed to shift, leading me in circles until I learned to ignore them and trust only my compass. The quarry sat in a natural depression, surrounded by limestone cliffs on 3 sides. The water was black, absolutely still, reflecting nothing even in direct sunlight. The abandoned equipment, rusted cables, a collapsed crane, a few derelict buildings gave the place an apocalyptic feeling. But it was the structure near the water's edge that stopped me cold. Someone had built a shelter out of branches, mud, and what looked like deer bones. It stood about 7 feet tall, dome-shaped, with an entrance facing the water. The construction was sophisticated woven branches, sealed with mud, reinforced with larger bones. Fresh scratches marked the entrance posts, 5 parallel grooves on each side. Inside, the floor was covered in fur and dried grass. The smell was overwhelming, musky, animal, but with something else, something almost metallic. Bones lined one wall, sorted by type. Skulls, ribs, femurs, all cleaned and arranged precisely. Not randomly scattered like an animal's den, but organized, cataloged. I photographed everything, took measurements, collected fur samples. Then, I noticed the drawings. On a flat piece of slate near the back of the shelter, something had scratched symbols. They weren't random. There were patterns, repetitions, possibly counting marks. One section showed phases of the moon. Another seemed to map the marsh, with X marks at specific locations. I heard the splash while studying the slate. A single sound from the quarry water, like something large, submerging. I went to the entrance and looked out. Ripples spread from a point about 50 feet from shore, but the water was too dark to see beneath. I waited, weapon drawn, for 10 minutes. Nothing surfaced, but I felt watched. That primitive sensation of being observed by a predator. Every instinct told me to leave immediately. I made it halfway back to my car before I found the first print in the mud. Fresh, less than an hour old. It had been following me, staying just out of sight, matching my pace. The print was identical to the cast from Barbara's encounter. I stopped trying to be quiet and moved faster. More prints appeared, sometimes beside my path, sometimes crossing it. Whatever was following me wasn't trying to hide anymore. It was showing me it could get close whenever it wanted. A branch broke to my left, heavy and deliberate. I turned and saw movement in the cattails, something large shifting position, then silence. I kept moving, my hand on my weapon, sweat running down my back despite the cool air. The next sound came from my right, closer, a low rumble, not quite a growl, more like a deliberate vocalization. It had meaning, rhythm, almost like speech, but in tones too low for human vocal cords. I reached my car as the sun touched the horizon. As I fumbled for my keys, I saw it. 60 feet away, standing at the edge of the grass, partially hidden by a willow tree. Exactly as Barbara had described, 7 feet tall, covered in dark fur, proportioned like a human but wrong in every detail. The face was the worst part. It was looking at me with unmistakable intelligence, studying me with the same intensity I'd been studying its shelter. We watched each other for maybe 10 seconds. Then it spoke. Not words, but modulated sounds that had the cadence of language. 3 distinct phrases, repeated once. The meaning was clear, even without understanding. You saw, you know, remember. It turned and walked back into the marsh. Not on all fours like an animal, but upright, with purpose and dignity. I saw it stop once, pick up something from the ground, a stone maybe, and examine it before continuing out of sight. I sat in my locked car until full dark, engine running, trying to process what had happened. Everything Barbara Hendricks had reported was true. The creature existed, it was intelligent, and it had let me leave. I never filed a report about the shelter or my encounter. What would be the point? Instead, I began my own documentation. I returned to the quarry twice more, always during daylight, always armed. The shelter remained but showed signs of modification, new bones added. The slate drawings changed, fresh bedding material. On my 4th visit, I found something that changed my understanding completely. A leather journal, water damaged and decades old, hidden in a crevice near the shelter. It had belonged to Marcus Brecht, the quarry worker who disappeared in 1952. His entries described encounters with what he called the Old One of the Marsh. According to Brecht, the creature had lived there for generations, known to the Native Americans who avoided the quarry area, feared but also respected as something between animal and human. Brecht's final entry, dated the day before his disappearance, was different. It showed me the truth today. We're the intrusion. We're the ones who don't belong. This land was theirs before we named it Wisconsin, before we called them myths. They've adapted, hidden, survived. But they remember everything. They remember when they didn't have to hide. I kept investigating quietly for another 3 years. More sightings occurred, always following the same pattern: roadkill consumption, brief encounters, no attacks on humans. The creature seemed to be scavenging, living on the margins, avoiding direct confrontation. Barbara Hendricks called me once, 6 months after her sighting. She'd been doing her own research, finding historical accounts going back to French fur traders in the 1700s. Les hommes bêtes, they called them, the beast men. Described as intelligent, dangerous when cornered, but generally avoidant of human contact. I think about that night constantly, she told me. Not with fear anymore, but with questions. What are they? How many are there? How long have they been here? I didn't have answers then. I still don't. In March 1992, Development began on a new shopping center near the marsh. The construction crews reported equipment vandalism, tools going missing, strange sounds at night. One bulldozer was found completely disassembled, its parts arranged in a perfect circle. The development was eventually canceled due to environmental concerns, though no official report ever explained what those concerns were. I transferred to Madison in 1993. The official reason was career advancement, but the truth was more complex. I couldn't continue living at the intersection of two worlds, the one we all agree exists and the one we pretend doesn't. Every roadkill deer on Highway 18 made me wonder if it was watching. Every report of a large dog or bear sighting made me think of that intelligent gaze. I took the plaster cast with me. It sits in my home office now, 31 years later. Sometimes visitors ask about it, and I tell them it's a conversation piece, a replica of a movie prop. They laugh and move on to other topics. But occasionally, someone will study it more carefully and ask, "This is really detailed. What's it actually from?" I tell them the truth. In 1989, a woman swore she saw a werewolf eating roadkill on Highway 18. They always assume I'm joking. Barbara Hendricks still lives in Jefferson County. We exchange Christmas cards. Neither of us has ever seen the creature again, but we both know it's still out there. The sightings continue, a trucker here, a hunter there, always the same details, always dismissed. The Jefferson County Sheriff's Department has a file 3 inches thick of similar reports. They label them misidentified wildlife incidents. The marsh remains undeveloped. The state bought large portions of it in 1995 for wetland preservation. The official surveys note an unusual lack of large predators in the area, which they attribute to hunting pressure and habitat loss. They don't mention that something else might be filling that ecological niche. I retired in 2015 but kept my notes, my photos, the few that developed properly, and the journal I found at the quarry. Sometimes I think about writing a book, laying out all the evidence, connecting the sightings across decades. But then I remember that moment of eye contact, those modulated sounds that felt like a warning or maybe a plea. You saw, you know, remember. So I remember. I keep the truth without trying to prove it, because maybe that's what it wanted. Not exposure, not confrontation, just acknowledgement that it exists, that it has always existed, that our highways and developments in modern world are just the latest chapter in a much older story. Every Halloween, when the news runs its obligatory werewolf stories and people share urban legends about the Beast of Bray Road, I think about Barbara Hendricks making that drive home from her shift. I think about how she handled seeing something impossible with such composure, how she insisted on being believed, not because she needed validation, but because the truth mattered. The truth does matter, even when we can't do anything with it, even when it's safer to file it under unknown animal incident and move on. The truth is that something lives in the marshes of Wisconsin that shouldn't exist. It's intelligent, careful, and older than our records. It eats our roadkill, avoids our cameras, and watches us from the tall grass. And sometimes, on foggy October nights when the conditions are just right, someone sees it clearly. They call 911, make a report, and join the small, quiet community of people who know that the world is stranger than we admit. The creature I saw that day at the edge of the marsh hasn't been photographed clearly. No body has been recovered. No scientific expedition has captured proof. But it's there. Barbara knows it. I know it. And now you know it too. The next time you drive through Wisconsin on a foggy night and see something large near roadkill on the highway, you'll wonder. You'll slow down, squint through your windshield, and try to make sense of proportions that don't quite fit. And if you're very unlucky or very lucky, depending on your perspective, you might see it stand up on 2 legs, regard you with intelligent eyes, and walk calmly into the marsh grass. If that happens, do what Barbara did. Stay calm, document everything, file your report, and know that you've become part of a story that's been unfolding for longer than Wisconsin has been a state. longer than America has been a nation, perhaps longer than humans have been keeping records. The werewolf of Highway 18 isn't a legend. It's a neighbor we pretend not to have, living by rules we don't understand, in places we've agreed not to look too closely at. And maybe that's the arrangement that works. They take our roadkill, we take our developments elsewhere, and both species continue their parallel existence in an increasingly crowded world. But the evidence remains. In files marked unexplained, in plaster casts on retired cops' desks, in the memories of night shift nurses who saw something impossible and had the courage to report it anyway. In 1989, Barbara Hendricks swore she saw a werewolf eating roadkill. She was telling the truth.